So I'm actually going to start by reading a brief story from your new book, Alex, called Becoming a Changemaker, because I think it's very powerful and it sets the foundation for why we originally wanted to talk to you. Here it goes. Yes, we can. This saying is probably familiar to you. It became the rallying cry of Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. It's a stirring phrase, and one that goes far beyond an American election. Although the genesis of this uplifting call for change was similarly political, just not in an electoral sense. It started with Dolores Huerta, an unlikely labor leader, who initially thought that Cesar Chavez was kidding when he suggested they team up to start a union for farm workers. She was a single mother of 11 children and had plenty of reasons to say no. But she drew upon her deep empathy from her time as an elementary school teacher to motivate her response. She recalled seeing children coming into her classroom without shoes and with empty stomachs, and knew that she needed to take action in support of farmers and their families. Farmers at the time made less than $1 an hour and often lacked access to toilets, cold water, and breaks, despite working from sunrise to sunset. Even though she didn't have any formal experience as a negotiator, she and Chavez led a nationwide grape boycott. The bold move eventually resulted in grape growers signing some of the first ever contracts for farm workers that the United States had seen, engaging millions of people in the process. Her work led to better pay and benefits for grape growers alongside much needed protections. And in response to aggressive pushback telling her, no, you can't create these changes, she coined the movement's slogan, Si se puede, Spanish for yes, we can. So that's where I wanted to start, because that is a super powerful story. And I really think it sets the foundation for what we're here to do today in terms of like shining the light on what it is to be a change maker, shining a light on what it is to be a student, shining a light on what it means to be be able to execute on your ideas.
Well, thanks for that. Delighted to be joining you today. And thanks for sharing that. One of my favorite stories from the book as well. So I'm glad it resonated with you.
Absolutely. So you are a UC Berkeley Haas, business school professor. You're a co-founder of a nonprofit called startsomegood.com. You led an incubator for social innovators in Scandinavia or in Sweden. So you're working with leaders around Scandinavia called Reach for Change. You're an advisor to a number of startups and their leaders. You're an author of the book, Becoming a Changemaker, which we'll cover and which I just read from. You're a parent, a husband, a friend, and you're more. So let's start by getting to know you by actually trying to get a sense of what you're most obsessed about these days.
Well, I mean, I think my number one obsession is my son. So out of all the identities that you talked about, I think the one I'm proudest about is being a dad. And so he's turning 2 tomorrow as we record this. And so I think I'm obsessed with watching him grow, helping him grow, and kind of thinking about what the values and the experiences we want him to have are.
That's awesome. Happy early birthday to your son. And I will say that it's pretty interesting that you're putting this content out there. I don't know if you think about this, but it sounds like you kind of do in terms of the legacy you're going to leave. At some point, your child is going to be able to read if he can't already. And I know that's kind of a joke. 2-year-old, I don't know if they can read yet, but at some point, he's going to come across your content and material, and that's the legacy that you're going to leave for him.
Well, I hope that it makes him proud. I didn't think about that going into it, but I do certainly think about this idea of sort of service. You mentioned my book, and I have to say I'm a reluctant author. I know you interview a lot of authors on here, and there's plenty of people who have written dozens of books and are kind of like meant to be writers, and that's not me. I actually wasn't planning on ever writing a book, but as you mentioned, I teach at Berkeley Haas and created and teach the class called Becoming a Changemaker, and I had enough students come up to me after the class ended, talk about how the course changed their life, how it gave them a voice, and just all these impacts that it had, and that it should be a book. And I sort of brushed off the first few, but after enough students told me that and how they wanted more of their friends to be able to get the messages, that's sort of what motivated me to write it. So even the act of writing it is an act of service. And while I don't think about my own legacy as such, I do think about that idea of like getting ideas out there in the hands of more people. And so if at some point my son finds them as well, then that would be extra special.
I love that. And that's interesting that, you here you are basically creating a course from scratch. Most folks likely unrealize how hard that is to do. I'd be curious if you can share your experience building a course from scratch, what you learned. Obviously, you felt the impact from your students and you've gone to scale that, but what was the experience building something from scratch in
Well, I
terms
think
of building a course to putting it together?
yeah, I think one of my strengths is perhaps my naivete, which is that I jump into these things without quite knowing exactly how hard things will be. And so I didn't realize how hard it would be to create a class, because the truth is most people that start teaching at a university, they're usually building off of a class that already exists, kind of in the traditional course catalog. I had a different way of thinking, because in creating this class, I wanted to create the class I wish I could have taken when I was just beginning my own Changemaker journey. And quite honestly, nothing like it existed anywhere at Berkeley or at other universities. And so that required sort of creating something from scratch. Well, I guess I should start with the story of how I got even in the place to create the class in the first place.
Yeah. Okay.
So I was meeting with the senior assistant dean for instruction at UC Berkeley Haas. So he's kind of the one that oversees all the faculty, all the curriculum. And his name's Jay, and he's been kind of a mentor to me throughout my career. So went to him for advice on another sort of career transition I was working on. But about halfway through, he could tell my heart wasn't really in it. And I'll remember the words he said. He said, "But Alex, what do you really want to do?" And I said, "Well, what I really want to do is teach." And then, imposter syndrome sparked up, and I started making excuses for all the reasons that I shouldn't teach and blah, blah, blah. But he interrupted me and he said, "Well, Alex, what do you want to teach?" I said, "I want to teach becoming a change maker." And that moment it became super clear what it was I was meant to teach. And to my surprise and delight, he said, "Okay, put together a syllabus, show it to me, and let's go from there." And so I remember just feeling elated that someone else believed in this vision, believed in me. I shook his hand, walked out the door, closed it, and then immediately pulled out my phone and Googled how to create a syllabus, because I actually had no idea what I was doing. But that started the process of creating a class. And so as I started putting it together, I started really using empathy to kind of put myself in the shoes of like, okay, imagine that I hadn't had all these experiences as a change maker, supporting change makers. What would I want to have known? And I got to reflect back on all the books I had read, all the change makers whose paths I was fortunate enough to cross along my journey, the ideas, the insights, the inspiration that had sort of carried me, and then began putting it all together. I think there's a couple different ways people approach putting together a class. Some are sort of like piece by piece, like, okay, week one's got to be this. But I really started with like week 15. I started thinking about, okay, students that have now been through the class, what do we want them to have experienced? What do we want them to have learned? Where should they be? What's that transformation going to look like? And then I really did that sort of backward mapping to say, okay, in order for them to be at this place where, for instance, they have the courage to act on their ideas, what are the lessons they need to learn along the way? And sort of mapped it back from there. And then I guess another part of being a new professor and a new class is that there's no path dependency. And so if you're teaching a traditional econ class, there's like the stuff you've got to teach in a certain way. But I sort of went into it fresh and started thinking about how can I do it in a really experiential way where students are actually learning what it takes to be a change maker. We will, of course, read case studies and we'll look at empirical frameworks and data. But how can they go experience these things in the real world as well in a safe but uncomfortable place? So that way they can actually get that confidence that really only comes from having led change.
I love that story, and clearly there's a passion, and you've dedicated your career to this. And what's interesting is that you mentioned that like you just create the course that you wish you took, and that's a theme that you kind of highlight throughout your book, which is be the leader that you want to be the mentor that you want to be the husband that like be the person you wish you had around to teach you these things, is kind of like one of the themes that you kind of allude to in your book. Just sticking on your life as a professor real quick, what is it like going in day one in front of a classroom, and what are you feeling? What are the jitters like? I know from my experience, it's only been as a student walking in on day one. What is it like to be a professor on day one, having to teach a course?
Oh, I so appreciate that question, because all of us listening know what it's like being that student on the first day. But I don't think we ever really hear what it's like from the faculty side of things. And so for me, I had jitters, right? Because I was first time professor teaching a brand new class. And honestly, I had no idea what the response would be like. But I'll forever remember that moment when I walked into my classroom for the first time. And what I saw, honestly, nearly moved me to tears. I saw that not only was every seat taken, there were so many students interested in the class that they were sitting on the stairs, they were sitting in the windowsills, like the classroom was absolutely packed. And in that moment, it became clear to me, like, this was my purpose. Like, this was my opportunity, was to help all these students become change makers. It's not that I did anything special, but I just tapped into this energy and enthusiasm that people have, this feeling that they want life to be more than just going through the motions, and they want to be able to affect change around them. And, that's my hypothesis. I believe that to be true. But when I saw that actually returned with all the students in every single seat filled, well, that continues to drive me today to support people like them.
It's incredible.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I think a lot of millennials, myself included, might not be spending that much time with folks in 18 to 22 age range. And I know undergraduates are among the cohorts you teach. Can you kind of give us a sense for those who maybe aren't spending much time interacting with Gen Z, what you've observed about that generation, and just kind of give us a beat on like how they're doing? How what does it seem to be that they value? How do they think about the world? How do they think about themselves? Any perspective would be awesome.
Yeah, Jay, so you're exactly right. So I started teaching undergrads. I also teach MBAs, and I also teach executives through UC Berkeley Executive Education. So I get the pleasure of teaching people everywhere from like age 18 to age 60, 70. And so it's really fun to see how that changemaker message lands with different audiences. But yeah, so I teach undergraduates every semester. And I am so pro Gen Z. I joke with my students that I want to self-identify as Gen Z, even though I'm a millennial, because a lot of the way that they show up in the world really resonates with me. I think a lot of them are looking for a greater sense of purpose. There's a study that found that 70% of Gen Z only wants to work for a company that shares its values, which I think is a really healthy thing. They're committed to climate. They're much more outspoken about mental health, about racial justice. I think that their values are strong. And on top of that, and again, we should be careful with generalizations about any generation, but I think the millennials, we were pretty good. I'm a millennial myself. Identifying things that were sort of broken or things that should be fixed. I think Gen Z are pretty good at being like, no, we're going to change this. Like this isn't right. Like, let's do something about it. And that really gives me some hope. But to round out a full picture, I'll also say that it's a very stressed out generation. And there's some sample bias perhaps teaching at Berkeley, but there is so much stress among these students that I teach. I mean, just overbearing stress. And of course, part of it is like looking at the world today, a more polarized world, having lived through recessions, the climate catastrophe upon them, but also just the environment which they grow in, social media being a big part of it, comparison being a big part of it. I see just so much more stress among my students than I ever experienced when I was in the classroom.
Yeah,
so
I
then
believe
how do
it.
you go about that, like in terms of helping them understand that what they're because it's hard to relate to that level of stress? How do you actually help them understand that what they're experiencing is quote unquote normal? I know there's no normal, right? Everyone's having their own experience, but like, how do you help them navigate the environment? How do you help them actually understand what change really is? And really just like, how do you help them think about it? Because that's one cohort. I'm also curious about how you have this conversation with some of the folks that are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who maybe need a re-education on how to embrace change. Like, how does that conversation, how is it different from one side of the spectrum to the other?
Well, so yeah, starting with the sort of undergraduates, a couple of things I really focus on is the first, creating this feeling of psychological safety in the classroom. I think when people feel scared or anxious, they often don't feel safe. And so I want them to feel very safe in the classroom. That doesn't mean that they won't be pushed. So I believe in being safe but uncomfortable. So sort of pushing them beyond what they think they're capable of doing, because that's where growth really happens. But before that's even possible, they've got to know that they're safe. They've got to know that they're respected. They've got to know that I'm looking out for them and that I care about them not just as someone in my grade book, but as humans. And the amount of mental health challenges that my students come to me with in a given semester, it's heavy stuff, and I'm grateful that they trust me with that. But it's a lot that they're dealing with. We also talk a lot about sort of where your motivation comes from. Sort of, is it intrinsic or extrinsic? And I think with social media, with being at a high pressure place like Berkeley, there's so much extrinsic pressure. This idea that someone else just got a job at Google or Facebook, and so that's like what the ideal is, and I'm not living up to that. And so I really try to help them tap into that intrinsic sense of motivation, their own purpose, their own values, and to remind them that they want to live the life that they want to lead. They're not leading someone else's life. And so how can they tap into what they really want, not just what sort of appears good on the outside? I see that so many of them, I think they overcorrect for the pain of a first job. So like they just want to get that first job no matter what. And of course, there's times where it's just based off of, needing money. I totally get it. But oftentimes they're so worried about like what that first job says about them. And like, that's the embodiment of like, did they have a successful college career is like what that first job is, that they kind of forget that their career will be 40, 50, 60 years. And that first job really won't have that much of an impact once they look backwards. So I try to help them get some sort of sense of perspective. When it comes to working with the more executive audiences, perhaps not a surprise. I oftentimes have to overcome a little bit more skepticism at first, but that's where I really lean into the data, lean into the research. And so we talk about, even if you personally don't feel driven to be a change maker, to lead change, I think the last couple of years have shown us you don't really have a choice. And I show a graphic, a cartoon that shows a bunch of people, kind of like corporate types, sitting in a conference room. And the CEO is saying, oh, digital transformation. Yeah, we can put that off a couple of years. And then right outside is this wrecking ball, which is labeled COVID-19, which is about to hit. And I think that's a good analogy for what life is like, that I believe that our careers will be defined by our ability to navigate, shape, and steer change, that it's not enough to just try to survive change, but we've got to get up ahead of it. And so as executives, as leaders, as managers, it's no longer a nice to have, it's a necessity. And so rather than kind of going along kicking and screaming, let's give you that sense of agency, that sense of purpose, that intrinsic motivation that says, yeah, I could do something about this change and I can make it work for me, for my team, for my company.
Yeah, that's true. Because at the end of the day, it's also part of like breaking out of old thinking patterns as well. And, sometimes, that's all it takes, right? You have to unlearn something to actually now find that new path for growth. And I imagine that there's a lot of unlearning that's likely taking place maybe at the executive level more than there is at the undergrad level. And to your point around that first job comment, you're right. I mean, I remember the pressure of having to nail that first job and thinking that, that's what's going to be the job that I have for a number of years. In many cases, it is for people, but at the end of the day, it's also the opportunity to understand like who you are, what you like, the environment you want to work in, the people you want to surround yourself with. It should be treated a little bit less rigid and with more flexibility in terms of like, this is kind of like a living experiment, my first couple of jobs. And then I'm going to land somewhere that truly aligns with who I am internally. And then that's going to launch me for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So there's there's more flexibility. It's interesting. You have to be flexible in that situation, and you have to be flexible as an executive to unlearn some of your old thinking and patterns.
Yeah, and that goes back to the title of the chapter that you started reading to start our episode, which is Students Always. That idea that you have got to remain adaptable and flexible, and that as soon as you figure out exactly how things work, well, things are going to change all around you. I mean, look at companies that felt like they had everything figured out by January of 2020, and then COVID hits, and then things are thrown up in the air. You've got to be constantly adjusting and adapting, because otherwise you just won't survive.
One of your values is optimism. And I think there's a thread here that connects with some of the skepticism we see on the part of people who may believe change is impossible. I think optimism is such an important building block for human thriving, and one that we might not talk about as often as some of the other big ones like health or education or work ethic. But without optimism, I think like without the belief that you can bring whatever vision you have for your life or for the world out into the space around you, I think it's almost impossible, one, to recognize opportunity when it presents itself, and then two, like take the first step towards that opportunity. And a thinker I really respect, Naval Ravikant, has made the point that a lot of times we conflate pessimism with intelligence, like with all the negativity that we've internalized from the media, all the problems that we see in surround sound, around us. There's the sense that only a fool could be optimistic, but we might say counter to that, only an optimist could change the world. So I'm curious, Alex, how you think about optimism and where you've sort of found it in your own life.
Yeah, I think it takes some courage to be optimistic. But that said, I think that optimism has gotten kind of a bad branding recently, because there's the concept of toxic positivity, which I want to differentiate from. So toxic positivity is the like things are really bad. You're like, oh no, man, it's cool. Like everything's good. Like don't worry about it. Don't stress. And that's not the optimism that I'm talking about. That is toxic positivity. The optimism that I'm about is, I think, nicely said by the words of poet Amanda Gorman. She delivered the poem "The Hill We Climb" at the inauguration of Biden and Harris. And I think the final 3 lines are a nice way to think about this. She says, "For there is always light if we're brave enough to see it, if we're brave enough to be it." I love that. For there's always light. That's the idea that things may be dark right now, but there's always another path forward, that there's always a better way. Tomorrow can be better than today is. And on top of that, we can be the one that illuminates that path forward for others. There's always light, if only we're brave enough to see it. I think what you're saying about pessimists and sort of being rewarded is true, that it's very easy to look at some possibility and go, now that can't ever happen. Nope, here's the reason that it won't happen. But as a change maker, can you see things that others may not see quite yet? And it doesn't have to be grounded in like wide-eyed hopefulness, not grounded in anything. You can recognize that there's a real problem, but can you identify a system that needs to be disrupted or a status quo that needs to be changed and see things that others may not see quite yet? And then that third part, if only we're brave enough to be it, it also takes courage, that it's not enough to just sort of believe tomorrow can be better, not enough to just see things, but you got to stand up and take some action. And so do you have that courage to stand up and go, yeah, look, I don't know exactly that path forward. I can't see 100 steps in front of me. I can see a couple steps. I believe it's a path worth taking and I'm going to do it. Come along with me. It takes courage. But I think that's what change makers are able to do.
Yeah, that's a great
100%.
question, Jay. Great answer, because I think you're touching on the change maker mindset and a lot of the traits that go along with it. And you're basically showcasing that this is applicable and accessible to anyone, really. You could be a parent, you could be an immigrant, you could be a student, you could be an artist, you could be a scientist, you could be an introvert, extrovert. It doesn't matter. I mean, this really is within you, and it's really a matter of the choice that you're going to make between burying your, putting your head under the ground and just going about every day, or realizing you have strength within you and you have the power and agency to bring your ideas to life, and that the world is really actually craving it. You need to be yourself and you need to put yourself in the world and do it in a safe way and take that calculated risk and have that courage and just believe that there's going to be a way, that there's always a possibility that a different way is possible, right? Like there's always that idea in your mind that, I could go a different way.
That's exactly right. We need people that step up and take those paths. I think a lot of my work is grounded in a place of humility, which is that I can't possibly know exactly what the world needs, but I do know for sure that the world needs more change makers, needs more people that are able to lead change from where they are. And so you started hinting at this, but that's one of the fundamental building blocks of the entire book, of all my work that I do, this idea that each and every one of us can be a change maker. The definition that I put forward in the book, I say simply, a change maker is someone who leads positive change from where they are. And you'll see that in that definition, there's no mention of roles or of titles. I believe that an entry-level product manager has just as much claim to that title of change maker as a Nobel Prize winner. And that it's this inclusive identity we can layer on top of our existing ones. So you could be a change maker lawyer, a change maker artist, a change maker parent. It's a way of seeing the world around us and our role in shaping it.
Yeah, you share a really interesting story on this concept of, thinking about different ways, where there was a person at a company, like a chief analytics officer at a company, and he was trying to figure out which one of the employees are going to stick around, which are the employees that are like loyal. And what he noticed is that if he looked at who actually took the time to download Firefox as opposed to Internet Explorer, told him about the fact that, okay, this person is willing to do something that's beyond the default. So I probably killed that story. You probably could tell it a lot better, obviously, but there's that example of like, if you're going to do something that's beyond default, it actually could work in your favor in terms of like making you stand out as opposed to just fitting in all the time.
That's exactly right. Just to give a little more depth to it, that's Cornerstone On Demand, which is an HR agency. And yeah, what they found is that the people who went and they downloaded Firefox, or let's give Google a shout out, also Chrome, one of those two, which are not the default browsers, that meant they were more likely to stay on the job and more likely to thrive. And what a helpful way to look at the world, which is that, you have the hand that you're dealt. You've got the computer that shows up in front of you. And do you just accept that browser, or do you accept that maybe there's a better way? It's not that the browser itself gives superpowers, although, I do have my preferred browser, but it's about, what does that mindset that says, yeah, maybe there's another way. Let me explore it. Like, what does that then make possible in everything else that you do?
Exactly.
Yeah. And I'm sure as a creative person like yourself, you've had a lot of ideas over the years on how you can affect positive change in the world. I'm curious, like, how do you kind of filter this massive landscape of ideas down to what you ultimately decide to move forward with and pour your heart and soul into? What is that kind of process of like whittling down all the potentials into where you actually direct your finite amount of energy and passion?
Yeah, for me, I think you got to pay attention to like what really sticks with you. So I have lots of ideas all the time. But in the case of Start Some Good, the social enterprise that I co-founded, it was the idea that like I would think about first thing when I woke up in the morning. I think about it at night when I was showering. And after a while, I was like, this idea isn't leaving me. So going back to being a dad, one of my favorite books that I read to my son is called What Do You Do With an Idea by Kobe Yamada. And it's a beautifully done book. It's sort of about this idea that follows a kid around. And I think that's how you can also think about it, is that like to be a change maker, to be a social entrepreneur, you've got to be obsessed with the idea, because change is hard. You shouldn't just jump into it flippantly and be like, oh, yeah, I'm going to lead change and not really care about it. There's so many things that the world needs, that our communities need, that our companies need. I think you've got to be really committed. And so there's something to paying attention to the ideas that just keep sticking with you. There's ideas that come and go, but when you keep reflecting on something and you kind of can't let it go, that may be a sign that it's calling out for you to take action on it.
I can tell that you get obsessed about an idea, but let's stick on startsomegood.com for a second here. What else did you learn about your own style and your own leadership when you were trying to build something from scratch? I mean, part of the reason I was interested in bringing you on was because to me, you're an expander, right? You're a person that's doing so many different things. You have, diverse background, diverse experience. And so I love doing this podcast for that reason, because my brain is interacting with people that have done things, that are building something from scratch, that have an entire career. So I'm going to learn from you. And so I'd be curious, like, can you tell us more about your experience building startsomegood.com from scratch and what you learned about your own style that way?
Starting someone from scratch is hard. Again, but in naivete, not knowing exactly what it took going into it, but just driven by an idea. And I think the first thing that I learned is that you got to have a team around you. That's one of the first things that I did. And it was just very instinctual. So it's a tech platform. So obviously we had to have a technology stack to be built. And fortunately, I reached out to a couple of friends of mine from UCLA. We connected because we would camp out for all the UCLA basketball games when we were students. And we always sort of dreamed about working on a startup together. And fortunately, one of them was a front-end coder, one was a back-end coder, and sort of made the pitch to them, hey, join us, let's do this thing. And so they came on board to do that. I then realized, well, one of my weaknesses is around sort of communications, marketing, branding. And so reached out to another friend of mine, Tom Dawkins, to join. And after about a week or so, where I think he was supposed to work like 5 hours a week, he was working like 40 hours a week. Like he was equally obsessed with this idea as I was. And at that point, it became clear, like this guy wasn't just like a coworker. He's a co-founder. And so he became part of the co-founding team as well. And I think that's absolutely crucial, because one of the things that I learned is that in this case, social entrepreneurship, but broadly leading change, can feel really lonely. When you're sort of at the top, there's not a lot of people you can turn to. And I think it's crucial that you have folks around you that can support you. I also found that in terms of community outside of the company as well. So I was fortunate to be selected for this social entrepreneur fellowship. And along with 19 other young change makers from around the world, we traveled to Istanbul, Turkey for a week-long fellowship. And the people I was with, we could not have been more different in terms of our lived experience. Just in terms of the countries represented, we had Peru, Brazil, Colombia, South Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Poland, UK, Germany, Cambodia, Japan, Australia, I mean, literally all around the world. And I distinctly remember this moment where we are sort of standing on the rocks about to jump into the water below. And we sort of yell out, fortunately for me in English, 3, 2, 1, and then jump. We jump in as we're splashing around in the water, and we see the sun sort of setting on the horizon. I looked around at these 19 other people and realized that, on paper, there's so much that makes us different. We came from such different backgrounds. we're even working on different change efforts, whether that's work supporting the local community in Kampala, Uganda, or children going through cancer in Mexico, or in my case, Start Some Good. We're all working on different changes, but there's something united us. Like, we were all change makers. And even though our experiences, our careers were very different, that idea that we each wanted to drive change and lead change was more powerful than anything. And so in that moment, I realized the power of a change maker community. And even today, we're still part of a WhatsApp group. And so when I get a text from one of them, it gives me this sort of jolt of energy and inspiration, where I remember, like, yeah, like, we're all in this together. And they continued their change maker journey. Even that's about 10 years ago. We're all still on it in some way. And that gave me a lot of support and comfort. So community, finding a team around you. And then I think the third thing is around the importance of vision, that when you start a company, when you start a change, you kind of have nothing. You kind of have nothing. All you have is just the idea you put out there. And so I'm not saying I was perfect at this, but being able to paint that picture of the future to bring others along on the change journey with you. And in the case of Start Some Good, we had a lot of different types of people to bring on board. We had the people who would raise money on our site, so the social entrepreneurs. We had the people who would donate money on our site, the donors, the supporters. Then also we had to bring on partners and other organizations. Even when I was trying to recruit, more technologists, you have to sell that vision. I think that oftentimes entrepreneurs go a little bit too far, and we see, especially here in Silicon Valley, that there's that sort of reality distortion field. People kind of lie about the future, kind of like forget, and that's not the best type of vision. But there is an aspect, I think, of being able to paint that picture that others can't help but want to be part of, and that's a powerful way to engage others in the change.
Yeah, absolutely. So how might somebody go about actually beginning to influence folks? And, from your research, do you have any data on, like, the not only the effort it might take, but more importantly, like, how much change do you need to see in the network for that to then become like a scalable event, if that makes sense? Like, it may not take it takes a lot of effort, right? But if you can get maybe like the first 20 people to sign on to something, does that then exponentially grow the platform? Like, do you have stats and data on that in terms of
Yeah, fortunately, I do. Not my own research. This is research done by Damon Santola at University of Pennsylvania. And he did fascinating work on tipping points among social conventions.
Tipping points. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So what he found is that they tried these experiments where they looked at what percent of people in a group need to adopt a new norm in order for it to be likely that the entire group then takes it on. And so if you were to ask me, I would have guessed at least 50%. I would have said like probably 60 or 70% realistically, like maybe 51%. But their research finds it's only 25%. You only need 25% of people. So think about a group of 100. You only need about 25 people to come on board to make it likely that that change will take hold. And to me, that's a really inspiring number, because when we try to lead change, we often get so focused on thinking about like, okay, we've got 100 people to convince, got to get all 100 on board. And that's nearly impossible, especially with any change that really is disruptive. Knowing that only 25% are needed in most cases becomes much more manageable. I think about someone I worked with who was working at a big manufacturing company in the Midwest, and he's super passionate about composting. And he kept trying to get the company to compost, and his efforts would continually fail. And that's because he's trying to get his entire 200-person company, like everyone had to be composting every meal all the time. Of course, that's not going to take hold. But so instead what he did is he focused on just getting 25%. So just getting 50 people to start composting. And when he did that, it became much more manageable. He found a group of like 6 or 7 people who were equally passionate, kind of delegated to them, got them involved. He got them to talk to their teams, to their managers, and they sort of, took over their part of the office. And then once it got to the point they got about 50, then it took hold. And then people did end up composting. And so change feels much more achievable when instead of going for 100%, you realize, no, let's be smart about it. Let's get to that 25% and then let the power of social networks take over.
Yeah.
That's
I love
really
that.
interesting.
That's and that's inspiring too, because again, like, of course it's hard to build something from scratch, but get to 25%.
Yeah. And it seems like a kind of bottom up approach to change, instead of like knocking on the decision maker executive's door, trying to come in with your pitch to change the organization from the top down. It's, as you said, find people that are that already have an affinity for whatever initiative you're trying to advance, and sort of build it up from the ground up.
So anyway, maybe we can talk about how change makers can balance the risk that they're going to take relative, because the action that they're going to, so if you're going to put yourself out in the world, that's an action that carries some risk. So how can a change maker think about the risk they're taking? Is there an easy tool that you can talk about, or a method or a thought process that someone should be going through before they make that bold move?
And when we look at Changemakers, sometimes we see like, oh, they're just like bold, crazy risk takers. And we think, well, that's what I have to be. But the way I like to think about risk is not that it's about taking a ton of risks. And it's not about like either you're born with it or not, nature or nurture. I don't kind of care what your initial risk tolerance is. I'm focused on, can you learn to take more smart risks? But the smart risk aspect here is key. That's being able to do things like protect the downside of risk. So make sure that even in the worst case scenario, that like you'll still be able to manage it. But then a simple tool that I really like is one called the Risk Quotient. And it sounds deceptively simple. When I'll talk about it, you'll be like, yeah, duh. But in working with all types of executives and change makers, I found that it's not just any one single risk that stresses them out. It's the sheer number of them and knowing which ones are worth taking and which ones aren't. So the risk quotient simply is the potential rewards quantified 1 to 10, low to high, over potential losses. So rewards over losses. And then you first identify qualitatively, what are the rewards? What are the benefits from having done it? What are the costs? And then you try to put them in a number, 1 to 10. Again, it sounds deceptively simple, but actually thinking it out helps you understand, is this a risk that's worth taking? There could be huge, huge payoffs, but if the potential downsides are huge, huge, huge as well, may not be a risk worth taking. Can you find one where maybe the downside is a little bit smaller and then it's worth taking that smaller risk? It'll be an individual calculus for each of us, but it's a tool you can use to help understand, is this a risk worth taking, so that you can get a little bit more comfortable with those smart risks.
And is there a ratio that's best, or how do you think of, obviously you want to mitigate the downside? What in your mind is a sort of healthy relationship between potential upside and potential downside to warrant diving in?
Yeah, for sure. So the founder of it, he says that it should be a 3-to-1 ratio. I think there's a bit of individual room for variability there, but 3-to-1 is what the founder said.
I like that.
And this is on a scale of 1 to 10, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Nice. Okay. So in your work with, now kind of going back to, the fact that you led a tech incubator, if I understand correctly, what did you notice in terms of those leaders and their ability to trust other people? Because I imagine that high achievers, people that are super obsessed, they have this one vision, they trust themselves, but they may struggle to trust other people. Can you talk about how someone might be able to start trusting more people to help them grow into a leader or grow into a CEO or whatever they want to grow into? Because I think trust has a lot to do in terms of whether or not you're going to do this thing by yourself, or actually you have like people that can push you.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And what I found among folks, I think you called this out rightly, that often when you're a high achiever, you get to where you are because you do things the quote right way, which is your way. What I found is working with these people is that those that weren't good at trusting, that one of two things happened. So either they burn themselves out because they try to do everything, right? So you have like a senior executive who's still like approving every tweet that goes out. Or on the other side, they just never reach their full potential because it's like they realize there's only so much they can do. They never get the team on board. Oftentimes in the kind of entrepreneur world, it's like they never trust someone enough who could be a COO or CFO type to complement them. And so the organization just never matches the potential of its vision. And so I think there's 3 ways to think about trust. The first is learning to trust yourself. Then it's learning to trust others. And then it's third, gaining the trust of others. And so we can talk about each of those. But in terms of the core of your question, which is like, how do you learn to get better at trusting others? I'm a big believer in being clear on the what and flexible on the how. So in other words, as you delegate, be clear on what it is that you need to have done. What are the non-negotiables? So you might say, look, we want to plan an event we want it to be focused on, I don't know, crypto. We want there to be 4 guest speakers, 2 men, 2 women. And then beyond that, you don't care. You don't care if it's digital, virtual, or in person. You don't care if it's catered or not. You don't care if they advertise the event on Instagram or through flyers on campus. Like, you could have lots of things you don't care about. Be clear on what you do really care about, and then give people the flexibility to innovate on what it is that they do best. Because no one wants to work for a micromanager. If all you're doing is telling someone exactly how to implement it, well, you never leave any room for creativity or growth. You're just having robots that do things for you, and that will stifle your growth. But I also recognize that it can be scary to delegate. And so if you're clear on the things that are non-negotiables, like you would not be happy if it ends up with a panel of only 1 person. Well, cool. Then you've made that clear. They know they've got to get 4 people, and then they have the flexibility to go recruit from there. The second thing that you can think about is, protecting that downside of risk. So think about, like, what's the worst possible scenario here, and how can you mitigate against it? So in the case of this event, you might say, look, I've never delegated to this person ever before. I've never met them in person. I don't know if I can really trust them. Okay, so what you do then is set the deadline to be 2 weeks in advance, 2 weeks before the actual event. That by that point, they've got to have the caterer, the panel, the venue, et cetera, all booked. That way, hopefully they've done it, in which case then you've got 2 extra weeks. And in the worst possible case, which is they've totally flaked, they stop returning your emails, they've just disappeared. Well, okay, then you still have 2 weeks. It'll be stressful, but you can still put it together. And knowing you have a bit of that buffer gives you the confidence to say, yeah, go run with it, because you know that even if they fail, you'll still be able to recover. And then the more you get used to that, the more you see that most times people come through, then you can loosen the grip a little bit.
Right. Yeah. On the topic of leadership, I'm curious, Alex, if you could choose one leader, maybe it's someone you met, maybe it's someone you haven't, to sort of be your personal mentor, who would you want to most learn from directly if you could have the privilege?
That's a fun question. And I guess I would go back to my personal hero, who is Jackie Robinson. So he's, of course, the one that broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball, and not a traditional leader in the sense that, as far as I know, he never managed a team or had like weekly stand-up meetings or anything like that. But one of the things that I deeply respect about him is the way that he went about his work, that he was clearly a very talented athlete, a 4-sport athlete at UCLA. But it was so many of his changemaker qualities that made him successful. His resilience, his empathy, his high EQ, his toughness, his tenacity, his flexibility. And I think I deeply admire the fact that those were skills or mindset or traits that anyone can develop. And so we would have loved the chance to have learned from him how he went about developing them and what he did when things got tough.
That's a great answer. What an inspiring person too, Jackie Robinson. I didn't know he was a 4-sport athlete. That's see, you learn something again almost every minute in my life. But we've talked a lot about, the traits that inclusive leaders take on or inclusive change makers take on. What are some of the traits that less inclusive leaders or change makers carry, and what are things that maybe they should look out for in terms of like the feedback that they're getting from the people around them, so that maybe they can think about doing things a little bit differently?
Yes. I mean, the first is overpowering others. I worked with one leader who, quite honestly, he was brilliant. He's one of the most creative people that I've ever met. But he came to me and he was kind of asking this question. He's like, Alex, I don't understand. Like, the teams that I lead, I'm literally the only person that comes up with ideas. Like, no one else is coming up with ideas. I was like, well, that can't be true. But so I kind of sat on meetings to see what was going on. And here's what happened. Someone would ask a question, and then he would, like, in a second, like, jump in and make his case. And the thing is, he's really smart. He's really creative, really persuasive. And so he would say, this is what we should do. Here's why. And then people would just kind of quickly be like, yeah, okay, sounds good. And people wouldn't actually think for themselves, because he would always sort of steal that microphone as soon as it happened. What I got him to see is that he's got to learn. He's good at, like, stepping forward, but also part of leadership is taking a step back, making space for others. And so I encouraged him to never be, or less frequently, be the first person that puts his voice up in the room. And a couple of things happen. One is that sometimes other people will come up with the exact idea he would have come up with, in which case then he can then champion it. And then great, he got his idea anyway. In the case that it didn't, well, he can still share his idea, just give other people a chance before they weigh in and see what they have to say. That way you hear from other voices as well. A second thing we see is where you lean into biases. And look, the truth is we all have different biases. I think we've got to be very careful in terms of how we include others. Another tangible example is that one team I worked with, they would tend to have conversations on Monday morning to be all about like, hitting the golf links or skiing the slopes, which is great if you golf or you ski, but not everyone golfs or skis. And so, you're inadvertently leaving a lot of people out from being part of the conversation, all because you gravitate towards those things. And so asking questions of others to bring others into the conversation, I think is super important as well.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, yeah, go for it.
Oh, no, you go ahead, Arjun.
No, I've been talking a lot. You say.
Yeah, I was going to say, no, I think that connects with one of the ideas that we got from Marshall Goldsmith, who is a phenomenal executive coach, been doing it for decades. He was on the podcast. We just released an episode with him in December. And one of his pieces of advice he gives to executives is that your recommendations become orders. So from someone, on the receiving end of a comment, you may just be sort of spitballing, but if you're the first to speak, you sort of take the air out of the room, take the space out of the room for others to put their ideas forward. And they're very likely to sort of agree with you and carry out whatever idea you put on the table first. So I think there's a lot of symmetry there between the advice that he gives to executives and the ideas that you're sharing here right now, Alex.
Yeah, great advice, like being keyed into those dynamics. And then a third thing you can do as well is, as a leader, can you model your own failability? I think we often get into leadership positions and we think that, well, because I'm the leader, I've got to have all the answers now. And so you feel this pressure that's like, even when you don't actually know the answer, you got to like show up with false bravado and be like, yeah, that's the answer. When oftentimes people honestly don't know. And so a couple of things you can do there. The first, of course, giving other people space to answer first. But we've talked about. And the second one is like, even if you think you know the direction to go into, invite others to critique it. Say something like, could be wrong here, but here's what I'm thinking. Or here's an idea, but I'd love to hear, what do you see as weaknesses here? Or like, help me see some of the flaws in my thinking here, because this is what I'm thinking currently. And again, the downside there is that, you heard other ideas. Like the worst that happens is you hear other perspectives on it. You still decide to go forward with that plan, but you've heard some of the weaknesses. They've strengthened the argument. You've heard what, a critic in the marketplace might say, and you can prepare for it. And it just takes that comfort level with being a bit humble to say, look, no one's perfect. No leaders are perfect. And I'll admit when I'm not sure about something, but that actually makes it safer for people to be part of the conversation with you.
Yeah, tying that back to Marshall Goldsmith as well. I mean, he kind of alludes to leaders being careful of adding too much value. To Jay's point, to your point, because your suggestion becomes an order. You don't give everyone the space to actually breathe and give their ideas life. And so I would also say that another part of leadership is self-discovery, because if you don't do the work on yourself, if you don't understand your own nuances, if you don't understand your own like imperfections first, then it becomes much more difficult to appreciate, accept, or understand those of others. And so you have to like do the work on yourself as well. And that's another layer of leadership that maybe is appropriate in this conversation.
Yeah, and a continual process too, right? It's not like you do the work just until you get to be CEO or executive director, and then you're like, okay, cool, done. But no, it's a continual process that you're going through to always be doing that self-work.
Yeah, and they're some of the people that are most obsessed with getting feedback. I mean, they have teams that give them 360-degree feedback. I mean, these folks want to figure out ways to get better. And I find that really interesting because, being someone that is striving to get to certain levels, I find that I struggle sometimes with feedback. I've been working on trying to be more vulnerable around it. But when I learn that the top CEOs in the country are obsessed with getting feedback, that inspires me to be that person to also go out and seek feedback. And that might be a form of micro leadership. You mentioned micromanaging. Micro leadership is something we can all do. It's just these smaller steps that are signs of being a leader that maybe you can, build on. Maybe you can talk more about.
For sure. So I think we often tell leadership through the story of like the single heroic leader. But that's not what real leadership really is. And I think when we think about leadership being on that pedestal, that so many of us look at that and say, well, I'm not naturally an extrovert like them, or I'm not naturally as charismatic as them. Does that mean I can't be a leader? But I think, no, absolutely not. I believe that leaders might be scarce, but leadership is abundant. There may be only one CEO, but there's multiple people that can practice leadership. We each practice leadership. And so this concept of micro leadership I put forward in the book is breaking leadership down to its smallest and most meaningful unit, which is simply a leadership moment. And if you think about it, these leadership moments appear before us dozens of times per day. It might be in a meeting, you notice that one of your colleagues has been quiet for a while, and you say, hey, no pressure, but we haven't heard your voice. Would you like to share what you're thinking here? Or maybe it's having the courage that when everyone else on your team is saying yes, that you're willing to say no. Or maybe it's just being willing to be the one that stays late to help your new colleague clean up after their first work assignment. These are all tiny little leadership moments, and you'll never go too far in them. But when you look back and you go, oh, yesterday I did 3 of these, today I did 5 of these, kind of start looking back and realize, wow, I've become a leader. Like, no one had to give me permission to be a leader. I gave it to myself. And once I gave it to myself, how different the world looks in terms of your ability to act, step up, and serve others.
No, I love that. I think that. Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say I love that, and I think it connects back in with your idea that you can be a change maker at any level of the organization. You don't have to be a CEO to be a change maker. You can be a leader and a change maker regardless of what station or title you occupy.
Absolutely right. It's crucial.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this conversation has just been a pure invitation for people to believe in themselves. You just alluded to it, to give them permissions to lead, give themselves the permission to lead. It's an invitation to lean on your own experience in life, because that is going to be the source of your insights that you're going to share. Like, you can use your life experiences and share what you've learned, and that is a form of leadership. It's just also an invitation to lean into the data that you're studying, to lean into the curiosity that you might have, to lean into the unknown. And quite frankly, it's just an invitation to have, it's an invitation to grow the courage, to have the courage to grow.
Love that. Nicely said.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, one more thing I wanted to ask you, Alex, kind of getting back into the sort of psychology of the modern individual. A lot of people right now are talking about being stuck, and there's a lot of, I think, coaches and sort of self-help thinkers advertising their services to help people get unstuck. And I was thinking about what that really means, being stuck. And I think if we were to make a word into a sentence, it would probably be stuck in your comfort zone. So as someone like yourself that's traveled all over the world, lived abroad, worked abroad, I imagine at various points in your life, made a foray into teaching, made a foray into authoring books. You've continually charged into the horizon of your comfort zone. Any thoughts you might give to folks that are feeling too intimidated by the unknown to step into it?
Yeah, I'll share insights that come from one of my favorite pieces of research that's, I think, ever been done, or certainly in the last couple of years. So this was some Italian researchers, and they looked at entrepreneurs who were in an incubator in Italy, and they only did one simple intervention. The intervention, they took half of the entrepreneurs, and all they did was taught them the scientific method. So that's like hypothesis testing. What they found is that the group that had learned the scientific method, they were more likely to pivot, so more likely to make changes in direction and strategy, and also generated way higher revenue. So what's the lesson here? What's the insight? It's that when we stop thinking about our decisions as personal failures and instead just act with curiosity, it opens up so much more possibility, right? Think about the scientist. He's in a lab and she's, I don't know, titrating chemicals, whatever a scientist does. And it doesn't go the way that she expects. She doesn't go like, oh, I'm a terrible scientist, like I should give up on scientists. She goes like, no, okay, that didn't work the way I thought. So now let's come up with the next hypothesis. And I think if there's a red thread to my life and career, it's just been being willing to test hypotheses. It's like, would I enjoy teaching and giving it a shot and finding out like, yeah, I absolutely do. And there's plenty of other things that I've tried that I don't like, but being willing to give it a try. And instead of thinking you have to do things perfectly, so it's not like, okay, I'm going to write a book and I have to be a New York Times bestseller or else it's not worth it. No, you're just putting a test out there. You're kind of, this is my hypothesis. Let's give it a shot and see what happens. And life feels much more manageable, much more doable, and risks seem much more within our own reach when we think of it as hypotheses to test.
Next thing you know, you're looking back saying, yes, we can, and yes, we did.
I love that. What a nice way to tie together the episode there.
There you go. So I encourage folks to go out and pick up Becoming a Changemaker. Alex, definitely want to say thank you again from the bottom of my heart. I'll just speak for Jay as well in terms of spending time with us, sharing space. And I'm looking forward to just following your journey and seeing how many more other people you're able to inspire and the change that you're going to make moving forward.
Oh, I'm super grateful for this conversation. It was fun. We covered a lot of really fascinating areas, and just an offer to the people listening. Let me know how I can be supportive to you on your Changemaker journey. Certainly connect with me on LinkedIn. You can check out changemakerbook.com. And if you want to take something called the Changemaker Index to see what your greatest strength as a changemaker is, you can go to changemakerbook.com/index and give that a go there.
Wonderful. We'll include those links as well. And again, it's a pleasure. And thank you for being here with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Haas.